Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join our growing international community. Now let's get into our story today, which is going to concern Ukraine. And we're going to focus specifically on what could potentially be Ukrainian neutrality and what is now seeming like a dropped bid to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, we have been covering this conflict extensively, the one occurring between Russia and Ukraine. Essentially, the main catalyst for this, at the very least, what has been pushed in to the media and public eye by diplomats, politicians, and world leaders, is that this is a conflict over Ukraine's potential right to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, it is actually inaccurate to say that Russia's main motivation for invasion of Ukraine is the fact that it could become a NATO member one day. However, that is definitely a huge part of the reason that Russia has ambitions towards the country. Now, there have been peace talks that we covered yesterday that continued today between Russia and Ukraine. And unlike the previous three that have occurred since the invasion of Russia began on February 24th, so 20 days ago, this one actually seems as if it's going to produce some kind of agreement, which means that a ceasefire could be a likely result. A ceasefire that will eventually lead to peace between Russia and Ukraine. Now, that is too optimistic and too positive to say that that is going to happen, but there is a chance that it is likely. So let's cover exactly what the demands of Russia and Ukraine are. Now, Ukraine's demands are actually quite simple. One, they want a ceasefire, and two, they want all of the Russian soldiers that are inside Ukraine to get out of their country. So a complete Russian troop withdrawal. Now, what Russia wants, Russia has three main demands. Number one is that Ukraine drops its bid to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Number two is that Ukraine declares neutrality. And number three is that Ukraine demilitarize. Now, out of these three demands that Russia has, number three is the most subjective and complicated one to fully assess. Demilitarization of a country or a nation is not an objectively established term. So we're going to get into that one. But first, let's get into Ukraine and NATO. We're going to discuss Russia's demands one by one. Ukraine's demands are in fact quite simple. Ceasefire, withdrawal, peace. Russia's are more complicated. Now, number one is that Ukraine drops its bid from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This one is the most likely to occur, because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has in recent weeks demonstrated that he is dropping his intention of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, what needs to be fully understood is that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself never had any intention of allowing Ukraine into its ranks. Now, understand that NATO has a complete open door policy. And what open door policy means is essentially that any nation can join, and that not a single country out of any principle is barred or prevented entry from the NATO organization. Now, that being said, NATO explicitly refuses entry into its organization for any nation that has any ongoing, unsettled, and unresolved territorial disputes. Now, as you may know, Ukraine has quite a few territorial disputes that are unsettled going on with Russia, Crimea, and the eastern Donbass region, in addition to the fact that their entire country is under a Russian invasion right now. Now, the reason that NATO does not allow countries with territorial disputes into the organization is actually very, very logical. The reality is that NATO is completely obligated to, every member state of NATO is obligated to back up any other member state that is attacked by another nation or political actor. So if a country that joins NATO has some kind of territorial dispute, and this territorial dispute leads to violence or war, as they often do in many, many cases, every single member state of NATO has to get involved and declare war on the other actor that is at war with their new member state. Now, in the case of Ukraine, what this would mean, and what it would mean right now if Ukraine was a member state, is we would be at a world war with Russia. NATO wants to avoid a world war. Now, despite the fact that it is a Western organization that is led by the United States and its own political interests, NATO is, in its heart of hearts, a peacekeeping organization. At the very least, that's how it publicly presents itself. NATO does not want to put itself in any situations which are definitely going to lead to an unavoidable conflict. Now, the second demand that Russia has is for Ukraine to declare some kind of neutrality. Now, this is not a new idea. It's something that's actually been circled around for quite some time. It's been a proposal that has been shifted in front of Ukraine as a possibility to end Russia's territorial ambitions on Ukraine. At the very least, Ukrainian neutrality would serve in the interests of Ukraine, because if Ukraine declared its neutrality and Russia were to continue taking any military action against Ukraine, it would be completely unjustifiable. Not something, now I'm not saying that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine is justifiable, it isn't, but it can be made to look like it with enough effective propaganda and manipulation of the facts. A neutral country, invading a neutral country, cannot be manipulated to look like an act of peacekeeping, like this current act has been done. Now, Ukrainian neutrality would also put Ukraine in a position where it doesn't have to worry about Russian aggression or a Western push to join its ranks in other organizations like the European Union. But Ukraine wants to join the EU, and even though NATO will never allow it to join NATO, it still does want to join NATO. Though those last ambitions for NATO have been dropped, the ones for the EU still exist. A neutral country is going to have much more difficulty joining the EU than a non-neutral one. Now, that isn't to state that neutral countries are not members of the EU. Notably, Austria, which is a member of the European Union, is a neutral country. So that is still possible, and those doors for economic growth for Ukraine will still be open. This is actually a solution that works in Ukraine's interest and guarantees Russia that Ukraine will not just not join NATO, but will not partake in any other kind of military agreements or cooperation pacts with Western countries that put Russia's security concerns, that bring Russia's security into concern. Now, the final demand of Russia, the most complicated and the one that's completely unlikely to be accepted by Ukraine, is the so-called demilitarization of the country. Now, what does demilitarization essentially mean? Now, it should be understood that this is a very rare and almost odd kind of demand that you don't see very often in international politics or global affairs. But it's not completely unprecedented. Other countries which have lost wars have agreed to demilitarization, the most notable of which being Japan. After it lost the World War II conflict that it had in the Pacific Front with the United States, agreed to demilitarization. Japan does not, or at the very least, constitutionally, is legally banned and barred from having any kind of offensive military force. Now, in reality, just to understand what demilitarization looks like, that does not mean that Japan does not have a military force. It absolutely does, but it's called a defensive force, and all of its military spending and actions that are taken are done under completely defensive purposes. Any kind of offensive actions or any kind of offensive arms building is something that Japan wouldn't do, or at the very least, it would politicize it to make it look like it's going in accordance with its agreement of demilitarization. Now, Russia's demands are relatively unclear of what exactly it would expect this demilitarization to look like. But what we can conclude is that what Russia would want is a significant de-arming of Ukrainian soldiers, essentially taking away all of the teeth and the weapons and the ability to defend themselves, which have been absolutely crucial during this conflict, away from Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is never going to, or at the very least, it should not agree to this last demand. Now, the first two demands that Russia has are things that actually are workable. One, NATO was never going to accept Ukraine in the first place. The territorial disputes that Ukraine has with Russia fundamentally are probably not going to be solved in a very, very long time. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to continue being military conflicts. It's going to be a political one, trying to find a political solution for these territories. But there will continue to be unsettled territories in Ukraine. As such, its potential for membership in NATO is completely invalid because that is not taken care of. So the first demand is just accepting reality. Now, the second demand of Ukrainian neutrality actually plays into the interests of all parties. And as the name suggests, it is the most neutral solution for what is going on right now. But a complete demilitarization of its military forces is not acceptable to Ukraine. What needs to be understood is you have to look at this conflict right now. Now, in the early days of this conflict, Russia did gain some early momentum. However, this momentum was quickly shot down by a very strong, precise, dedicated, and brave Ukrainian resistance, which has completely stalled Russian soldiers. It needs to be understood that Russian soldiers have not moved very much since their initial attack on Ukraine. Yes, a city in the south was captured, Kherson, but outside of small villages or a nuclear plant or other small gains by Russian forces, no major cities have been able to be captured, and the soldiers that have been attacking these cities are stuck on the outside, not able to move past Ukrainian lines. And this is because of the extensive arming, military equipment, and training of Ukraine's military, its civilian forces, and militias that have also fought alongside the other defenders of the country. This militarization of Ukraine is the reason why it hasn't been completely toppled by Russia. Keep in mind, this invasion has been going on for 20 days, and Russia hasn't even managed to completely gain air superiority in the conflict. And in addition to this, Russia logistically is stuck. It does not have enough soldiers or military supplies inside Ukraine to continue carrying out its invasion, meaning that it's going to have to bring in other arms and other soldiers from inside Russia into Ukraine to continue their military offensive, making this a very large logistical and military nightmare for Russia, embarrassing the country and creating this conflict into not just a one-sided one. So now this means that peace is more likely. Russia wants this conflict to end. It's turning into a logistical nightmare. And we're not even talking about the number of sanctions that have completely closed the country off from the rest of the developed world. Ukraine obviously wants this conflict to end because of the massive humanitarian crisis that it has caused on its country. Over 3 million refugees have fled Ukraine. This is the largest migrant crisis in Europe since World War II. In addition to that, the United Nations believes that 789 civilian deaths have been confirmed. Now, the reality is that number is probably much higher. And we will know a more exact estimate after the war is over and bodies are able to be counted. Now, the humanitarian crisis is not just counting lives. Many people have been under gigantic sieges, the most nightmarish of which has been in Mariupol, where civilians have been completely cut off from food, water, electricity, heat, and medicine. Now, luckily, some peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have been productive enough to allow a humanitarian corridor that we talked about yesterday to go from Mariupol to the more western city of Zaporizhzhia. So far, 2,000 civilian cars have left in a convoy from Mariupol to the west of Ukraine, and 2,000 more cars filled with civilians are waiting to leave as well. So many civilians that have been in what is one of the darkest moments in contemporary history, which is the siege of Mariupol, are finally able to leave. This conflict has been costly. It has been dark. It has no military solution in the near future, either for Ukraine or Russia. It is essentially a stalemate. It is in the interest of both parties to come to some kind of agreement. Now, Russia's demands are not that obscene except the last one, which Ukraine cannot accept. Hopefully, the stalled situation will come to an end result where Ukraine is able to throw out that demand and peace is actually able to be established in the country. And we will be looking at a neutral Ukraine, which actually means for general world politics and world security, a more positive kind of situation. A neutral Ukraine is much less likely to be invaded, is much less likely to be determined as a security threat against Russia, and is much less likely to enter any kind of conflict. A neutral Ukraine is also going to open up the possibility for resolving some of the other territorial disputes that exist within the country, primarily Crimea and the eastern Donbass region. A neutral Ukraine will, at the very least, in the short term, bring an end to this current conflict. Now, those are my thoughts, and that's my analysis. These peace talks occurred today between a Russian and Ukrainian delegation. They're going to continue in the future until some kind of agreement is made. Understand that this is a massive glimmer of hope, but it is not a guarantee for peace. There is nothing guaranteeing that this conflict is coming to an end anytime soon. Understand that while these peace talks are occurring, fighting is increasing in its fervency. Missile attacks from Russia are increasing, and the fighting on the ground, especially around Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is becoming much and much more fierce. So understand, as these peace talks are growing in their intensity, so is the combat on the ground and in the air over Ukraine. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you think would be a reasonable solution to end this conflict. And let me know if you think peace is likely in the next reasonable time span. Let's say within the next week, next 2 weeks, or within the next month. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow.